Welcome back everyone. This is video number 2, easy explanation of the story The Sound Machine, written by Roald Dahl. Let's start from page number 104 today. Do check the previous video number 1, and there I had stopped till here. If it did, I will start from he stood there today. He stood there in the garden. The setting is the garden now. In the previous video we saw that the setting was a makeshift laboratory. This time it is the garden. He stood there in the garden beside the wooden table, so pale, small and thin that he looked like an ancient, consumptive, bespectacled child. Klausner is described as an eccentric-looking child. And this takes us back to Roald Dahl's earlier description of the machine as being the shape of a child's coffin. And this perhaps suggests that the machine will somehow be the death of Klausner's hopes of knowing the unknown. He is pale, small and thin. What is the meaning of bespectacled? Wearing glasses. The sun had gone down. There was no wind, no sound at all. And we all know that Klausner is so interested in sounds. From where he stood, he could see over a low fence into the next garden, and there was a woman, another character after Dr. Scott. And there was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. He watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. He was preoccupied with the thoughts of his invention. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on its front. He put his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on the knob that moved a needle across a large central dial like the wavelength dial of a radio. The dial was marked with many numbers in a series of bands starting at 15,000. So he makes adjustments and he will await the result of his experiment. And now he was bending forward over the machine. His head was cocked to one side in a tense, listening attitude. His right hand was beginning to turn the knob. The needle was traveling slowly across the dial, so slowly he could hardly see it move, and in the earphones he could hear a faint spasmodic crackling. The meaning of the word spasmodic is occurring in brief, irregular bursts. Behind this crackling sound, he could hear a distant humming tone, which was the noise of the machine itself, but that was all. As he listened, he became conscious of a curious sensation, a feeling that his ears were stretching out away from his head, that each ear was connected to his head by a thin, stiff wire like a tentacle. We all know the meaning of tentacle, a slender, flexible limb or appendage in an animal bearing sense organs. And that the wires were lengthening, that the ears were going up and up toward a secret, forbidden territory, a dangerous ultrasonic region where ears had never been before and had no right to be. Human beings can never hear these sounds under normal circumstances. But Klausner is really ambitious and he is anxiously waiting for the result of this experiment. There is tension in the atmosphere, there is anticipation, there is nervousness and also apprehension. The little needle crept slowly across the dial, and suddenly he heard a shriek, a frightful, piercing shriek, and he jumped and dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. Just imagine the excitement, the thrill. He stared around him. He is startled, he is surprised, shocked, and he is eagerly waiting for an answer. He's looking for an answer, as if expecting to see the person who had shrieked. There was no one in sight except the woman in the garden next door, and it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. She was involved in her daily activity perhaps. She was just cutting yellow roses, a normal activity. She was cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket, completely unaware of the obsession of Klausner, of the anxious anticipation of Klausner. What was happening around her? She was completely unaware of this. Again it came. What kind of a sound? A throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. The note itself possessed a minor metallic quality that he had never heard before. This was a sound which he had never heard before. Where was it coming from? What was the origin of this sound? Klausner looked around him, searching instinctively for the source of the noise. The woman next door was the only living thing in sight. He saw her reach down, take a rose stem in the fingers of one hand and snip the stem with a pair of scissors. Again he heard the scream. For the second time he heard the scream. So we see that suddenly Klausner hears a shrill scream like that of a woman shrieking in agony, piercing through the otherwise still air. Looking around to identify the source of the sound, he sees no one except his neighbor, Mrs. Saunders, who is cutting flowers in the garden. Seeing her bend down to snip a rose stem, he is convinced that she was not the one he heard, when all of a sudden he hears the same screaming sound again at the exact moment when the stem is cut. Seeing this, an idea strikes him, and eager to test his theory, he asks Mrs. Saunders to cut another stem. Let us see now. It came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. At this point, the woman straightened up, put the scissors in the basket with the roses and turned to walk away. "Mrs. Saunders!" Klausner shouted, his voice shrill with excitement. He is excited. "Oh, Mrs. Saunders!" And looking round, the woman saw her neighbor standing on his lawn, a fantastic arm-waving little person. He is always pale, thin, little, but his ambition is somewhat different, not little at all. Arm-waving little person with a pair of earphones on his head, calling to her in a voice so high and loud that she became alarmed. "Cut another one! Please cut another one quickly!" She stood still, completely taken aback, staring at him. "Why, Mr. Klausner," she said, "what's the matter?" "Please do as I ask," he said. "Cut just one more rose." Mrs. Saunders had always believed her neighbor to be a rather peculiar person. Now it seemed that he had gone completely crazy. She wondered whether she should run into the house and fetch a husband. No, she thought, no, he's harmless. I'll just humor him. "Certainly, Mr. Klausner, if you like," she said. She took her scissors from the basket, bent down and snipped another rose again. Klausner heard that frightful, throatless shriek in the earphones. Again it came at the exact moment the rose stem was cut. He took off the earphones and ran to the fence that separated the two gardens. "All right," he said, "that's enough. No more, please, no more." The woman stood there, a yellow rose in one hand, clippers in the other, looking at him. "I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Saunders," he said, "something that you won't believe. Unbelievable." He put his hands on top of the fence and peered at her intently through his thick spectacles. "You have this evening cut a basket full of roses. You have, with a sharp pair of scissors, cut through the stems of living things, and each rose that you cut screamed in the most terrible way. According to Klausner, what is the source of this noise? This rather frightful, throatless shriek? Yes, the scream. And this scream has come from the roses. Did you know that, Mrs. Saunders? No, she said. I certainly didn't know that. It happens to be true, he said. He was breathing rather rapidly, again excited, but he was trying to control his excitement. I heard them shrieking. Only he could hear them shrieking. Each time you cut one, I heard the cry of pain. So this is a cry of pain, a very high-pitched sound, approximately 132,000 vibrations a second, beyond the comprehension of Mrs. Saunders. She is taken aback. You couldn't possibly have heard it yourself, but I heard it. Did you really? Mr. Klausner, she decided she would make a dash for the house in about 5 seconds. Oh, what an eccentric man Mr. Klausner is. This is the usual, the normal reaction of anybody who is confronted with such a weird theory all of her sudden. Apprehensive of her peculiar neighbor, Mrs. Saunders thought it better to comply with his request, and as soon as she cuts another stem, Klausner hears the same shrill scream again. And now he is fully convinced that it is really the flowers that are screaming out in pain as the sharp scissors cut through them. He runs to Mrs. Saunders and tells her about his discovery and also asks her not to harm the flowers any more. You might say, he went on, that a rose bush has no nervous system to feel with, no throat to cry with. You would be right, it hasn't. Not like ours anyway, but how do you know, Mrs. Saunders? And here he leaned far over the fence and spoke in a fierce whisper. How do you know that a rose bush doesn't feel as much pain when someone cuts its stem in two as you would feel if someone cut your wrist off with a garden shears? How do you know that? It's alive, isn't it? We all know that plants and trees have life. Yes, Mr. Klausner, oh yes, and good night. Quickly she turned and ran up the garden to her house. She literally escapes, runs away from that spot. Klausner went back to the table. He put on the earphones and stood for a while listening. He could still hear the faint crackling sound and the humming noise of the machine. Two distinct sounds, but nothing more. He bent down and took hold of a small white daisy. Another experiment in order to prove his theory. Growing on the lawn. This time it's a daisy. He took it between thumb and forefinger and slowly pulled it upward and sideways until the stem broke. From the moment that he started pulling to the moment when the stem broke, he distinctly heard in the earphones. This time it's a faint high-pitched cry, curiously inanimate. Learn the nature of the sounds during the various experiments. He took another daisy and did it again. Once more he heard the cry, but he wasn't so sure now that it expressed pain. No, it wasn't pain, it was surprise. Or was it? It didn't really express any of the feelings or emotions known to a human being. It was just a cry, a neutral stone cry, a single emotionless note expressing nothing. It had been the same with the roses. He had been wrong in calling it a cry of pain. A flower probably didn't feel pain. It felt something else which we didn't know about, something called toin or spur or pinnockment or anything you like. Here Klausner, like any other scientist, is following certain steps in order to come to a conclusion. Ask a question, the first step, and then perform research. Establish the hypothesis. Test the hypothesis by conducting an experiment. This is exactly what Klausner is doing over here. He is conducting experiments and then make an observation. Yes, this is the observation of Klausner. The nature of the sound, the source of the sound, analyze the results and draw a conclusion is the next step, and we will see whether he is able to come to a conclusion. Present the findings is the last step. Will he be able to present the findings? Let us proceed. Let us read and find out for ourselves. He stood up and removed the earphones. It was getting dark and he could see pricks of light shining in the windows of the houses all around him. Carefully he picked up the black box from the table, carried it into the shed and put it on the workbench. Then he went out, locked the door behind him and walked up to the house. The next morning, Klausner was up as soon as it was light. He dressed and went straight to the shed. He picked up the machine and carried it outside, clasping, holding it tightly to his chest with both hands, walking unsteadily under its weight. He went past the house, out through the front gate and across the road to the park. Another setting, the park. First the makeshift laboratory, then the garden, and now it's the park. There he paused and looked around him, and then he went on until he came to a large tree. This time it's a beech tree, and he placed the machine on the ground close to the trunk of the tree. Keep this in mind. He placed the machine on the ground close to the trunk of the tree. Quickly he went back to the house and got an axe from the coal cellar and carried it across the road into the park. He put the axe on the ground beside the tree. Then he looked around him again, peering nervously through his thick glasses in every direction. There was no one about. It was 6 in the morning. What will happen now? We will soon come to the climax of this story. I end today's session here, and in video number 3, I am hopeful of completing the easy explanation video.